What if I told you that in the 5th century, refusing to tithe to the Roman Catholic Church could get you killed? That's right. People were executed for not giving their 10%, but that's not even the biggest lie. The church has been hiding the fact that Jesus never commanded Christians to tithe. And yet today, pastors stand on pulpits and tell you that tithing is the key to your blessings. But what if I told you that's not true? Today, we're exposing hidden truths about tithing that most churches will never tell you. And once you hear this, you'll never see tithing the same way again. But before we break down these hidden truths, let's take a step back and ask, what does tithe really mean? Because to understand whether tithing is required today, we first need to know where it came from and what God originally intended. What does tithe mean? The word tithe simply means a tenth. In Hebrew, the word is me'azer, which literally translates to 1/10 or a tenth part. It was used in the Old Testament to describe a portion of a harvest or livestock that was set aside for the Levites, widows, orphans, and religious celebrations. In Greek, the word is decate, which also means a tenth, and appears in the New Testament when Jesus refers to the Pharisees' strict tithing habits. Now that we know tithe simply means a tenth, let's clear up some of the biggest misconceptions people have about it, because the way tithing is often taught today is completely different from how it was practiced in the Bible. Misconception 1. If you don't tithe, you're cursed. Okay, I know this sounds crazy, but some churches actually teach that if you don't tithe, you're robbing God, and that you're bringing a curse upon yourself. But is this actually true? If not, then where does this idea come from? Well, the most common verse used to support this fear-based teaching is Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 to 10, which states, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." But you say, "In what way have we robbed you?" "In tithes and offerings." You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. This verse is often preached with a very specific message. If you don't tithe, you are under a curse. But if you give 10%, God will bless you and open the windows of heaven. Sounds intense, right? But here's the problem. This verse is not talking to Christians today. Malachi was not addressing all believers. He was speaking to the priests of Israel. I repeat, Malachi was specific, speaking to all the corrupt priests. The entire book of Malachi is a rebuke to Israel's corrupt priests who were stealing the offerings meant for the temple. The curse was upon them, not upon every individual who didn't tithe. In fact, in Malachi chapter 1, verse 6, God literally rebukes the priests for dishonoring him. Malachi chapter 2, verse 1 to 2 states, "And now, O priests, this commandment is for you. If you will not hear, and if you will not take it to heart, to give glory to my name, I will send a curse upon you." Malachi's warning was not directed at New Testament believers, but at Israel's priests who were corrupting the system. In fact, there is not a single verse in the New Testament that says Christians must tithe, or that they will be cursed if they don't. Pause. All right, now before we go deeper into this topic, I need to tell you something important. There's a lot more to this story than I can even talk about here on YouTube. The truth about tithing, the financial system built around it, and the real reason churches push it so hard, it's deeper than you think. But here's the problem. There are some secrets I just can't explore publicly. That's why I created the Forbidden Vault, a private space where we break down the hidden biblical truths most churches won't touch. Inside the Forbidden Vault, we're uncovering the real reason tithing is designed to keep Christians poor, and the lost biblical teachings on money and giving that could change everything. So if you're ready to go deeper and hear what really happens behind the scenes, subscribe to the Forbidden Vault now. The truth is waiting, but only for those who are ready to find it. Misconception number 2. Tithing was only for supporting priests and pastors. Okay, let's talk about something that might surprise you. A lot of people assume that tithing was only meant to support priests and pastors. Like the whole reason for tithing was just to fund the temple and keep the religious leaders fed, right? But what if I told you that's completely false according to the Bible? Most churches today teach that tithing is all about supporting the church and its leaders, but when we actually look at the Bible, we see something totally different. Yes, the Levites, priests, received a portion of the tithe, but they weren't the only ones. The tithe had multiple purposes, and priests were just one part of it. Okay, let's break this down. According to the Bible, there were 3 different tithes in the Old Testament. Yep, you read that right. There wasn't just one tithe. There were 3. 1. The Levitical tithe. This was the first tithe. And yes, it went to support the Levites because they were the only tribe that didn't get land to farm. 2. The festival tithe. This one's wild. The Israelites were actually supposed to use their tithe to throw a giant feast and celebrate with their family and community. Literally, part of their tithe was meant for them to enjoy in God's presence. 3. The charity tithe. Every 3rd year, the tithe was set aside to help orphans, widows, and the poor, not to fund the temple. Yep, and let's be real, how often do you hear that in a Sunday sermon? Modern churches make it sound like every tithe is meant for the pastor's salary and church building projects. But the original purpose of tithing was way bigger than that. It was a system designed to support the Levites, who had no land or income, provide for the poor, widows, and orphans, fund community celebrations and worship. However, most modern churches only keep the first tithe, the one that supported the Levites, but they completely ignore the 2nd and 3rd tithes, the ones that helped the poor and funded celebrations. Even crazier, many churches don't even have Levites anymore. Think about it. Pastors today aren't Old Testament priests. They can own homes, have jobs, and earn income in ways the Levites never could. So should the same system still apply? Listen, I really want you guys to reverse this specific part and think of your answer, then leave a comment down below. This is very important to consider. Anyways, the bottom line is that tithing was more than just church funding. Yes, tithing supported religious leaders, but it also supported the poor and community celebrations. With that being said, if churches want to enforce Old Testament tithing, they should also be throwing feasts and giving directly to the poor. But they don't. So the next time someone says, "You have to tithe to support the church," remember, tithing wasn't just about that. It was about community, generosity, and justice. And Jesus made it clear that love and mercy matter way more than a percentage. Misconception number 3. Tithing was a fixed 10 every time. All right, I know we've all heard this one before. You have to give exactly 10th of your income to God, or you're not being faithful. But here's the thing. The whole idea that tithing was always a fixed 10th, that's not actually what the Bible teaches. And once you see what the tithe really was, you'll never look at that number the same way again. So, where did the 10% rule come from? Okay, so the word tithe literally means a 10th. That part is true. But here's the part no one talks about. There wasn't just one tithe. There were actually multiple tithes. And depending on the year, the total could be way more than just 10%. Let's break it down. Biblical tithing wasn't a simple 10%. It was more like 23 to 30%. Yep, you read that right. If we followed the Old Testament tithing system exactly, some years you'd be giving way more than 10%. Here's how it actually worked. Number 1, the Levitical tithe, 10%. This was given every year to support the Levites, since they had no land to farm. Number 2, the festival tithe, 10%. This was set aside for celebrations. Yes, part of the tithe was literally meant for feasting and worshiping with your family. And if you lived far away from the temple, you could even sell your tithe, take the money, and spend it on whatever you desire, including wine and strong drink. Number 3. The charity tithe, 10%, every third year. Every third year, a tithe was set aside to take care of widows, orphans, and the poor. That means in years 3 and 6 of a 7-year cycle, people gave an extra 10% just for the needy. So depending on the year, Israelites were actually tithing between 20 to 30% of their income in goods, not just a flat 10%. And here's the wild part. Even though the Levites received a tithe, they also had to tithe from what they received. This means that if your pastor is able to work and is making income outside of the church, you pastors should also be setting an example and tithing first, before even the members of a church. All right, so by now, we've uncovered some serious misconceptions about tithing. But here's where it all comes together. If Jesus never commanded it, and the early church didn't practice it, then why are so many Christians still being pressured into giving a set amount? Let's break down 3 biblical reasons why Christians should not be forced to tithe. And trust me, after this, you'll never see tithing the same way again. Reason number 1. Jesus never commanded tithing for Christians. If tithing was essential for salvation, faithfulness, or receiving blessings, don't you think Jesus would have mentioned it? But here's the truth. Jesus never commanded Christians to tithe. Not once. In fact, the only time Jesus mentioned tithing was when he was calling out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. Jesus stated to them, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Jesus wasn't endorsing tithing. He was rebuking religious leaders who cared more about money than about justice and mercy. Notice that Jesus never told his disciples to tithe. If tithing was still required under the new covenant, wouldn't he have made that clear? Think about it. Jesus spoke a lot about money, generosity, and helping the poor, but never once did he command his followers to give a fixed 10%. Instead, he taught heart-led generosity, not forced giving. Bottom line, if Jesus didn't command tithing, then why are churches acting like it's the key to God's blessings? Reason number 2. The early church didn't practice tithing. Another major red flag. If tithing was still required for believers, then why didn't the early church practice it? I ask this because in Acts chapter 2 verse 44, it states, "All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need." In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7, it also states, "Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." The early Christians didn't follow a mandatory 10% rule. Instead, they gave freely and voluntarily based on love, not law. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, never commanded a tithe. Instead, he encouraged cheerful, Spirit-led giving. No early church letters say, "Make sure you tithe 10% to the apostles," because that wasn't the standard. If tithing was a requirement for Christians, then why didn't Paul, Peter, or any of the apostles ever mention it? Bottom line is, the early church was built on generosity, not obligation. So why should modern Christians be forced to tithe when the apostles never did? Reason number 3. The church shouldn't use tithing to enrich leaders. Now, here's the tough part. Tithing today doesn't always go where people think it does. Many times in the Bible, Paul collected money to help struggling believers, not to fund a church institution or enrich religious leaders. In the Bible, offerings were primarily used to support widows, orphans, and the poor, help missionary work and spreading the gospel, sustain believers who were in need. But what do we see today? Many churches collect millions of dollars, while some members struggle to pay their bills. Some pastors live in luxury, while their congregations are told to give until it hurts. In fact, in African church there is a famous saying, where the pastor will say, offering time, and the congregation responds, blessing time. Tithing has become more about maintaining institutions than actually helping people. Paul emphasized giving to those in need, not enriching church leaders or funding extravagant buildings. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that pastors should be made wealthy through tithes. Bottom line, giving should be about generosity and love, not about making pastors millionaires. Giving should be from the heart, not under pressure or fear of curses. God isn't interested in your money. He's interested in your heart. So the next time someone says, you have to tithe or you're robbing God, remember, Jesus never commanded it. The early church didn't practice it. And God wants willing, cheerful generosity, not forced payments. All right, so we've busted the myth that Jesus commanded tithing, and we've seen that the early church didn't even practice it. But if that's the case, then why do so many churches treat tithing like a non-negotiable rule? Where did this idea of forced giving even come from? To really understand this, we need to take a trip through history. Because believe it or not, tithing didn't start with the Bible. In fact, its roots go way deeper into taxation, political power, and religious control. And once you see how tithing evolved, you'll understand why so many churches today get it completely wrong. The first reason that started forced tithing is the idea known as ancient tithing, a tax, not a religious practice. Before tithing was ever a law in the Bible, other civilizations had already been doing it, but not as an act of faith. It was all about taxes and controlling wealth. In ancient Babylon and Assyria, kings and temple priests required 10th of all goods and livestock as a tax to maintain their power. Some of this money went to idol temples, but the main purpose was to fund the kingdom and military. Egyptian and Persian tithes supported the elite class. Pharaohs in Egypt collected portions of their people's crops and labor to sustain the royal palace. In Persia, taxation worked the same way. Ordinary people had to give a portion of their income to the empire. So how this looks today? Think of modern government taxes. We all pay a percentage of our income to maintain roads, police, government officials, and public services. Imagine if your taxes didn't just go to the government, but also directly funded religious institutions, whether you wanted to give or not. That's exactly how ancient tithing worked. Tithing started as taxation, a system used by governments and religious elites to maintain their power. It wasn't about faith, it was about finances. How tithing started. Number 2. The Catholic Church institutionalized tithing. If Jesus and the apostles didn't enforce tithing, then how did it become mandatory? The answer lies in the medieval church's strategies to consolidate power and resources. 5th century, church leaders reinforced tithing. After the fall of Rome, the Catholic Church emerged as a dominant institution in Europe. To sustain its operations and clergy, church leaders began to emphasize tithing as a religious duty. 8th century, Charlemagne's legal enforcement of tithing. In the late 8th century, Emperor Charlemagne sought to strengthen the church's influence and ensure uniformity in Christian practices across his empire. To achieve this, he institutionalized tithing through secular law, making it a mandatory obligation for all citizens. Charlemagne's laws mandated that a tithe, a 10th of one's produce or earnings, be rendered to the churches and priests. Failure to comply with this mandate was met with severe penalties, including capital punishment. Examples of punishments for non-compliance: death penalty for certain offenses. Charlemagne's Capitulary for Saxony decreed that serious violations, such as acts of violence against the church or refusal to adopt Christian practices, were punishable by death. For instance, if anyone shall have entered a church by violence, and shall have carried off anything in it by force or theft, or shall have burned the church itself, let him be punished by death. If anyone, out of contempt for Christianity, shall have despised the holy Lenten fast, and shall have eaten flesh, let him be punished by death. While these laws specifically address offenses like theft from churches and violations of Christian practices, they reflect the broader context of strict enforcement of church-related mandates, including tithing. Fines and servitude. Lesser offenses, such as failure to baptize infants promptly or engaging in prohibited pagan practices, resulted in substantial fines. Those unable to pay these fines were often compelled into servitude to the church until their debts were settled. So how does this look today? While modern churches do not impose civil penalties for failing to tithe, the historical enforcement of tithing through severe punishments has left a lasting legacy. Some contemporary religious communities may exert moral or social pressure on members to contribute financially, invoking spiritual consequences rather than legal ones. The institutionalization of tithing was historically enforced through stringent measures, including severe punishments, to ensure compliance. Understanding this context highlights the evolution of tithing from a mandated tax to its current practice as a voluntary act of faith in many denominations. All right, we've just gone on a deep dive into the history of tithing, from its roots in ancient taxation to how the medieval church turned it into a forced religious obligation. And after looking at what the Bible actually says, we can see that mandatory tithing isn't a New Testament command. It's a man-made tradition that evolved over time. So what have we learned today? Jesus never commanded Christians to tithe. The only time he even mentioned it was when he rebuked the Pharisees for focusing on tithing while ignoring justice and mercy. Instead of demanding a set percentage, Jesus taught heart-led generosity. The early church didn't practice tithing. Early Christians gave freely, not under obligation. Paul never told believers to tithe. He emphasized cheerful, voluntary giving. Tithing became a legal requirement, not a biblical one. By the 8th century, Charlemagne enforced tithing by law, punishing those who refused. Over time, the church used tithing to build wealth and maintain power, instead of focusing on helping the poor. Today, many churches misrepresent tithing. Some pastors guilt-trip believers into giving, saying that not tithing brings curses or blocks blessings. Others use prosperity gospel tactics, promising wealth in exchange for giving money. This is not how biblical generosity works. So, should Christians give? Absolutely. But giving should be based on love, gratitude, and generosity, not fear, guilt, or manipulation. Giving should be voluntary, not a burden. It should be used to help those in need, not just fund institutions. God doesn't measure your faith by a percentage. He looks at the heart behind your giving. Now that you know the truth about tithing, what do you think? Have you ever felt pressure to tithe out of fear? Or have you always given with a joyful heart? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this opened your eyes, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, we uncover the biblical truths most churches don't talk about. And before you go, click on the next video. It's another powerful topic you won't want to miss.